So hi guys, in this video we are going to add the missiles that invaders can shoot at the player. Um, we have three different types of missiles in the original game. They change in terms of speed. Some of them are faster than other ones, and from what I read, they also change in the way that the damage that they create, at least for the damage that they create to the bunkers. I'm not exactly sure how that works. I wasn't able to find the way that implemented that or what type of damage is different from one type of missile to the other ones. Maybe they make more damage or less. I don't know. We are not going to be worrying about that. We'll use the missile types to create different animations and also just to change the speed of the missiles. We have like missiles that are slower than other ones. And so the first thing we are going to do is to import the missile costumes, the missile sprite and the costumes to the game. Just like we did with the invaders, we are going to have only a single sprite for the missiles, and then we are going to import all the costumes for all the type of missiles to that sprite. So let's start by choosing a sprite, uploading a sprite, and I'm gonna upload it doesn't matter if we start with the fast or the slow, so we have a fast missile, a slow, and a wiggly one. These are the three types and names of the three types of missiles. So I'm just gonna import the missile fast 0, which is like the first sprite, the first image of the fast missile. And then I'm going to import all the other ones. So upload costumes, and we come here to the missiles, and import everything, and also the missile explosion. We also have a sprite for the missile explosion when the missile is to use when the missile is destroyed. So import everything, and just make sure that the missile explosion costume is the last one, just like we did with the invaders. I cannot drag it, I don't know why. Okay, here and here. Yeah. So we have missile fast 0, 1, 2, and 3, slow 0, 1, 2, and 3, and wiggly 0, 1, 2, and 3. Each missile has 4 costumes. So now that we have a missile, I'm going to change this as well. It's just missile. And this one is also Invader 1-1, and the name of the sprite doesn't need to be Invader 1-1. It's just an invader. And it doesn't matter for the game, but it's nice to have it this way. So we have a missile, and now we need a way to shoot the missile. And basically what happens in the original game is that invaders, they choose a random invader, so randomly an invader is chosen, and it chooses a missile from its own position. And we can only have 3 missiles on screen at the same time, so we are also going to do that. So right now what we need to do is to find a way to choose an invader and then shoot the missile from that invader. And in the end, if I was using a different engine, the one that I'm usually used to work with, like Unity, I would simply create a list of all the invaders. I would have like all the clones that I could access, and then I would ask an invader. I would randomly select an invader from that list, and then I would ask that selected invader to just shoot the missile, and it would be the invader that would instantiate the missile on its own position, and then the missile would have all the behavior that would move down and destroy stuff and stuff like that. And this is like the object-oriented approach. I mean, we have different objects that communicate between each other, and each object does its own thing. Here we can't actually do that because we cannot access a clone of the invader and tell the clone to shoot. I mean, we can tell a specific clone to shoot, not a specific one, because messages, we need to have a way to filter if it's that clone that we want to make it to shoot. And then the clone could also create the clone of the missile, but we don't have an easy way to select a random clone with what Scratch has to give us. So we are going to do in a different way. But first, I want to explain the concept that we will be using. This is a new concept that we haven't talked about. So far, we already saw variables, and we have been using variables for everything. And just to explain a little bit more about variables, basically a variable is a space in memory. So when we create a variable, we ask the game to give us a space in memory. that we can store values inside that space, and we give a name to that space so that we can easily reference that value throughout the game. So for example, here on the invader sprite, the invader type is a space in memory that is holding the value of the invader type, and that then we can use the value or update the value throughout the game. And an important thing to understand here is that for the game, what we are storing inside the invader type, it doesn't matter. I mean, the game doesn't know that this variable is about the invader type. It only knows that it has a space in memory that has some name, and that space has the value 1, 2, 3, 0, whatever. So this is just something to make sure that you guys understand about variables. And why am I talking about variables? Because the other concept that we will be talking about is related to variables. So variables allow us to store a single value in a space in memory. Now we have another concept which are lists, and a list is similar to a variable, so it's also a space in memory where we can store stuff, but instead of being able to store just a single value, we can store a bunch of them. So let's just create a list, and create a list for all sprites, or yeah, for all sprites, because we are going to be using this list not only on the here, and we need a global list for the whole game. Let's call it invaders. We will change this in just a bit, and we have a list. And how does lists work? Lists have items, exactly, and each item has a number and a value. So the first item on the list has number 1 and has some value, item number 2, item number 3, and so forth. So for example, if I come here and add a new value here, I'm going to put a name, I don't know, John and Paul and Simon, whatever. So you can see we can add items to our list. Each item has a value, which is this one here, and each item is given a number. It starts at 1 and goes to infinity. I don't know what's the max amount of items we can have in lists in Scratch, but it doesn't matter. And this is important because when we are working with lists, we can either ask the list, okay, give me the value at number 1, or give me the value that you have stored in item number 1, or you can tell, okay, give me what is the number of the item with the value of John. For example, if we tell, okay, give me the value of item number 1, it will give us John. If I ask the list, okay, what is the number of the item with the value of Paul, it would give me number 2. And this is just like the basic behavior of lists. Now, my first approach here would be, okay, so I have lists. I want to just add the clones of the invaders to the list, and then I will be able to select the clone and do whatever I want with the position of the clone, instantiating the missile, everything. But here the problem is that we cannot add the clones to the list, and we can also, we don't have a way to say, okay, I want to add the clone to the list, and we also don't have a way to tell that clone, okay, I want to get this clone from the list and tell that clone, okay, now shoot the missile. We don't have easy ways to do it. So what we are actually going to do is that we won't access the clone, because we actually don't need the entire clone. We don't need to access the clone of the invader. The only thing that we need to actually instantiate the missile is to have the clone position, because that's where the missile is going to start. And that's the only thing we need from the invaders at this point. So what we are going to do is that we are going to create lists to store the position of the invaders throughout the game, because invaders are constantly changing their position, and the only thing that we need when we select a random invader to shoot is to have their position. So we are going to be using the lists to store the invaders' position throughout the game. Now, another thing, each position has 2 coordinates, so it has like an X and a Y. We cannot add these 2 values to a single item on the list. I mean, maybe we could add it as text, and then we need to process the text and separate the values, but we are not going into that. What we are actually going to do is to create two lists, one for the X positions and one for the Y positions. So let me just remove all this from the list. And let's change the name of the list for invaders position X. And let's create a new list called invaders position Y. And now we have two lists, and where we can store the positions, the position coordinates, X and Y. And we know that the first item of of each list is going to be the position of the invader number 1, for example. So now that we have this, we need a way to add the position of the invaders to these lists. And this is something that we are going to be doing throughout the game. So we need to add a new block that when the invaders start moving, it's where we are going to start updating the values on this list. So let's add a new event. When I receive the start message, we are going to do something which is, we need a forever, so it's constantly running. And here is where we are going to add the position of the invaders to the list. Now, how are we going to do that? Because we need to make sure that when we are adding items to the list, and as we saw before, when we add items, they are automatically assigned a number 1, number 2, number 3, and so forth. And we need to make sure that number 1 on each list is for invader 1, number 2 is for invader 2, and so forth. So what we need to do here is we need to have a unique way to uniquely identify each invader. And the way to do it is by using an ID. So we'll create a new variable, which will be the invader ID, and each invader will have its own ID. So invader number 1, we have the first invader to be instantiating will have ID number 1, and second invader will have ID number 2, and so forth. So let's create a variable, make a variable. We are going to create a variable called invader ID, and we need to select for this sprite only. Why? Because each invader, each clone, needs to have its own value of this variable. So you create a new variable, invader ID, for this sprite only, and now we need to change this variable so that each invader has its own ID. And this is an interesting thing because we need to see, we need to check this because I was recording this earlier and I made a mistake, and I'm going to over that mistake because it's really important to know this. Because one thing that we might tend to do or try to do is to change, to change the invader ID by 1, because we're going to be incrementing the invader ID inside, for example, when I start as a clone, because every time the sprite starts as a clone, we just change the ID by 1 and would be incrementing. But that doesn't work because the invader ID is a private variable. I want to call it private, and when I say private, it's a variable that belongs, each sprite has its own variable of this type. So if we do something like this, what will happen is that when the sprite starts as a clone, the invader ID will be 0, and we change by 1, so invader ID will be 1, but this will happen for all the sprites, because all the sprites start with invader ID at 0. So we cannot change the invader ID inside when I start as a clone. We need to change it before creating the clone. And why is that? Because despite having each clone having their own variable, when the clone is created, it gets the value, the variable that it's going to have gets the value that was on the original sprite. So this means that the invader sprite, I mean the original one, not the clones, also has an invader ID variable. And when we are incrementing the variable on that sprite only, that value is actually incrementing. So number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. And if we do it before cloning the sprite, the invader ID that the clone will have is the value that the original sprite had at that time. So if we change the invader ID by 1, when we create this clone, is the invader ID variable that clone has the value of 1. If we change again on the original sprite, now it's number 1, so we can increment it to number 2. Then the second clone will have the invader ID equal to 2, and so forth. So this is an important concept to understand about the variables for this sprite and for all sprites. And to be honest, I make a lot of mistakes with these all sprites and for this sprite only. I mean, it's not very intuitive, at least for me. I'm not very used to work like this, and you don't have an easy way also to look at the variables here and to understand, okay, is this like a global variable? Is this a variable only for that sprite? It's really hard sometimes to get my head around this. And I don't know, maybe they should do something about it, but no. This is my opinion, because they do it here. I mean, you can see that here you have like invader, how do you call this? Invader is 2 dots, I don't know, and invader ID, and if you have like a global variable, for example, I don't know, row index, waiter count. Yeah, if you have like a global variable, you don't have anything before. So this means that this is like a global variable everyone can access, and there is only one instance of this variable, only one value and one variable. And this means that each invader has its own invader ID. And this is cool. We can see it here, but we cannot see it here. So we cannot see, okay, which ones are the global variables and which ones are not the global variables, and we cannot see it here. So it makes a little bit more difficult, and I think it would be really nice to see or distinguish the variables inside the blocks, but that's another issue. So now that we have an invader ID, I mean, each sprite has an invader ID, we are going to use that ID to add the position of the sprite to the list. And why do we need the invader ID? Because first we need to make sure that we are always changing the value of that sprite inside the list, because we need a way to reference to say, okay, I want to change the position of the sprite number 1, of the invader number 1. And we are going to make sure that, okay, inside the list, the item number 1 corresponds to the invader number 1. So at the beginning, the list start empty. So we need to add, first we need to add a value to the list, and only then we need to keep updating that value with the position, because if we keep inserting values on the list, it will just grow infinitely. It just will grow and grow and grow, and we don't want that. So first we need to add the value. If the value does not exist, I mean, if the item with the ID of the invader does not exist, then we add it to the list, and once it exists, we just update that value. So how can we know if the value exists? We can make a condition here, and I'm going to use if then else, because if doesn't exist, we add it. If it already exists, then we replace the value. And a way to know is if the length of the list, so the length is the size of the list, the number of items that the list has. So if the length of the list is something where here, if the length of invader's position X is less than the invader ID, which means that, okay, a list is empty, it means that no invader has put their position there. And since this is going to run on each invader in sequence, so when the first invader runs this block, okay, the list is empty, so I'm going to add my value, the value of my position, to that list on the number that I have on my ID. So we do, when the length is less than invader ID, we insert the position of the invader. In this case, we are using the position X, so we need the X position of the invader at the ID of the invader, which means that we are going to be adding this at the item with this ID. So this is correct, and we also need to do this for the Y position. Let's do it here, Y position, also at the invader ID. Okay, just duplicate this, invader ID, change this to the Y position. And we only need to do the condition for the invaders for one of the lists, because if one of the lists doesn't have the value, it means that the other one also doesn't have it, because we are creating the values at the same time. So we don't need to do this condition, repeat this condition for each one of the lists. So when the list does not have the position of that invader, we insert the position of that invader using the invader ID as the item number. And when it already has the position, we just need to replace the value from the list of the list. So we have another block which is okay. Now replace, and now we use the invader ID. Replace the item with the number of the invader ID with the X position, and we do the same for the Y position. Here and here, yeah. So now when we start, I'm going to let the list here so that we can see that we are actually changing the values. You see that it added 55 values on each list. So we have the 55 values for the 55 invaders, and the X position is current is always updating because they are moving, you know, left and right, and the Y position is also updating. And actually, we can even change where we are replacing the item, because we don't need to be actually replacing the item inside this loop. We could just like take this and replace it after changing Y by 7, because it's the only time where the Y position of the invaders change. So that's a little bit more efficient, I think. And okay, so now we have the list, and inside each list we have the position of the invaders. And now we can use these lists to position the missile when we instantiate the missile and want to shoot it. Okay, so now I'm going to leave the list here so that we are still going to need the values in it. And now we go to the missiles, and we need to deal with creating the missiles and positioning them in the correct place. So first, we are going to start creating missiles only when the invaders start moving. Then we need, a forever block, because we are going to be constantly trying to create missiles. And how is this going to work is that we are going to wait for a few seconds, a random time, you know, like between 1 and 3 seconds. And each time we wait for that time, and when we reach that time, we try to shoot a missile. And in the original game, we can only have 3 missiles on screen at the same time, so we are also going to do that. And to know how many missiles we have on screen at the same time, we need a variable just to count the number of missiles. So let's create a new variable. Make a variable, let's call it missile count. Missile count. And this is a variable for all sprites, because this is a global variable on game and not specific for each missile that we are instantiating. So we create a missile count variable. And now at the beginning, we also always reset the missile count to 0. And then here we are going to start shooting the missiles. And like I said before, first thing we are going to do is wait a few seconds before trying to shoot a missile. Otherwise, we'll be like constantly shooting missiles, or not constantly, because we are going to limit the number of missiles to 3. But all the missiles the first 3 missiles will be shot at the same time, and we don't want that. So we can use this operator block, which is pick random, to choose a random time between 1 and 3 seconds. So each time this runs, the time that we are going to wait is going to be different. And that gives that sense that it's not like timed perfectly each time an invader is going to shoot. So you're right, we wait a random time, and then we only shoot a missile if the missile count is less than 3. So if the missile count is less than 3. And when the missile count is less than 3, we can then change the missile count by 1. But we create the missile, so okay, we have a missile on screen, and we create a clone of the missile sprite. So this block will only run on the original sprite and not on the clones. So there's not a problem, because only the first one will be working with this block. I mean, we will be running this block and waiting for the time and everything. And when he is able to shoot, we create a clone, and then the clone will do everything else. Now that we have here, we have this creating the missile. We can add the block when I start as a clone. And this is where we are going to position the missile and start moving the missile and everything. So now how are we going to position the missile? Because that's where when we need to use these two ifs that we created earlier. So basically what we are going to do is to choose a random invader from this list. So we are going to choose a random number, we're going to choose a random invader and then access the positions stored in the item of the list with that number. So the first thing that we need to do is to pick a random number, is to pick a random invader actually, and then use that value to select the positions. So because we need to first select a random value and then use that value to access the items on the list, we need to create a variable just for the sprite, like selected invader or selected invader ID, let's call it this way. So in a way, we need this. Why do we need this variable? We need this variable because we need a way to store the number of the invader that we want to access, and then use that number to access the items on the list. So let's create a new variable, and this we can create for this sprite only, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, create for this sprite only, we could also create for all sprites, but either way, since we are only be using this inside each clone, we can create for this sprite only. So by default, variables should be more private and global, let's say this way. So this is, let's call it selected invader ID. Okay, we don't need to see this. Okay, when I start as a clone, first thing we are going to do is to set the value of the selected invader ID. And the value of this variable is going to be a random number between 1 and the total number of invaders that we have, which we know that is 55, and we already know how to use the random block, so we can duplicate this. So I'm going to, not the bit delay, sorry, the selected invader ID is going to be equal to a random number between 1, and we could put here 55, for example, because we know that we have 55 invaders, but to be more dynamic code to work with, if we change something to our code, because this is like static values, let's suppose that tomorrow we want to change the number of invaders that we have, we want to add a new row or something like that, we need to come here and just adjust this number. So we can have a more automatic way of doing this, which is picking a random number between 1 and the length of the list. Because the length of the list will always have the total number of invaders that we have at the current time. So we assign the selected invader ID a random number between 1 and 55, which is the invader that we want at that time. And now we are going to position the missile on the position of that invader. So we go to the motions block, and we can use this block, go to, and here is where we are going to define the position X and the position Y of that invader. And how are we going to get that position? We need to access our list. So basically what we are going to do is we need to access item, and here we can use the sorry. Now I was like, okay, I'm missing the variable. Now I'm not missing the variable. We can use item of the selected invader ID of position X, and the same thing of the position Y. And in this way, we are accessing the values that are on the list. So once again, how this works is that we select a random number between 1 and the total number, the total length of the list. Then we have a number. Let's suppose that we have the number, I don't know, 20. I don't know, I chose 20, but yeah, we have the number 20. And then what I'm doing here is that, okay, I want the value of the item number 20 of the list invaders position X, and the same for the position Y. So the value will be 155 and minus 49. And that's where we are going to position the missile. So this is the way to use the list so that we can position the missiles correctly. And now that we have the missile on the correct position, we can show the missile. And I'm going to put it show because we're going to hide the original one. We don't want the original one laying there. And you can also hide the original one before starting all this. We are going to show the missile, and then we are going to move the missile. And the missile basically moves down. So we need a forever block. And inside the forever block, we are going to change the Y position of the missile by a certain value. And right now, let's do, I don't know what's the speed of the laser. We are doing by 8. Let's do it by 8 also, in this case minus 8 because it's going down. And yeah, so far this is what we got. So we are shooting missiles, placing the missiles on the correct position, and moving the missiles down. Let's see if all of this is working. So just gonna remove that. Okay. So the game starts, and the invaders start shooting. And yes, yeah, they are coming from random places, so it is correct. No, they are not shooting anymore. Okay. And why is that? Let me see. Invader missile, select invader ID is 0. Oh, yeah. Of course, it's not shooting anymore. Why is it not shooting anymore? Because we are not when the missiles are being destroyed, because right now they are being destroyed when they reach the edge of the screen, or we are not seeing the clones actually. We need to destroy the clone when it reaches the edge of the screen, and we need to decrease the missile count, because right now what happened is like it shot 3 missiles and then it stopped because the missile count is always greater than equal or greater than 3. So what we need to do here is to destroy the missile when it reaches the edge of the screen. And once again, we are not going to be using the touching the edge, because I had a lot of problems with that when I was combining that condition with others, which we will need to do because the missile will be destroyed when it reaches the bottom of the screen, when it hits the player, or when it hits a piece of the bunkers. So instead, we are going to be using the position of the missile. So we are going to destroy the missile when it reaches the bottom of the screen, which we know that the bottom is at minus 180, so we can destroy it at minus 170, for example. So let's add not this one, but what am I doing? Okay, no, this one here. Not let's add an if then else, because if it reaches something where it needs to destroy, then we destroy, else it changes its position. So if touching is on the sensing, if not touching, sorry, this was for touching the edge, we don't want that. If the position is less than 170, and if the Y position of the missile is less than 170, then we destroy the missile. And to destroy the missile, we know that we have to delete this clone. And before that, we need to make sure that we change the missile count by -1. So we decrease the missile count. So this keeps working as it should. And let's see. And now, okay, missiles. They are shooting missiles, and the missile count, okay, 1, 0, 1, 0, yeah, and it's working. They are only shooting one at a time, so maybe if we decrease this 1 to 2 seconds. Yeah. Oh, something happened here. We saw a missile that was coming from like an empty space here. Oh, here, yeah, that wasn't supposed to happen. Let's see what's happening here. Okay, I need to see what's happening. Also, number of missiles. I mean, maybe if we just change the speed, yeah, then we can have a lot of missiles. Yeah, but some missiles are coming from a weird position. Hmm. Okay, I need to check what's happening. Seems that they are not actually updating the positions correctly. But they should be doing that. I don't know. Yeah, but okay. I'll see that. I'll see what's happening. So we have the missiles. We are inserting the missiles on the correct position. At least I think so. I need to check why some missiles are coming. I don't know from where. I need to see what's happening. And we are moving the missiles, destroying the missiles, and resetting the count. And here I'm gonna put like maybe -8 was a lot, so maybe -5. I don't know. And so now we have the missiles. We are shooting the missiles. And yes, this is it so far. I'm gonna create a new video for the rest because I think this is already too long. And what we are going to do in the next video about the missiles, what we are still missing on doing, is changing the costumes of the missiles. I mean, creating the different missile types because we have the 3 different types. And also destroying the player. Because when the missiles touch the player, we should destroy the player. So we are also going to be dealing with that on the next video. And I'm also gonna check what's happening, why the missiles are coming from like a weird position. But what I'm thinking, I thought about this on the last video, is that we have some bugs that we need to fix on different parts of the game. We have some bugs that maybe when we are shooting, we have some bugs that the laser doesn't always appear, or it can kill 2 invaders at once. We have another bug, I don't know if you noticed, but the invaders at the corners, which are the ones that are touching the edge of the screen, are becoming more and more far apart from the others. We also need to fix that. We also need to fix this problem with the missiles coming from a random position that I don't know why it's happening. So what I'm thinking right now is that maybe I'm just going to continuing implementing the game, and then I'll do like a final video where we're going to fix all these problems at once, because I won't be dealing with them maybe right now. I don't know. We'll see. But this is it for this video. So thank you.